The 2024 Player's Handbook is out, and with all the commentary flying around about the rules changes, I do have a question. What exactly was wrong with 5th edition? That was rhetorical. Seriously, I feel like there's been a lot of hope wrapped up in this new Player's Handbook, and it's all been dashed to pieces. What exactly were we hoping was going to change? That's the question that I want to answer. What needed changing in 5th edition? I think you could ask just about any player or DM, and they'd all tell you something a little different. For my part, though, I think it comes down to 4 general issues. Poor guidance on how to DM, overall monster design, inconsistent rules that create hard-to-resolve edge cases, and lopsided balance among player features that creates an oppressive build meta. Those are just impressions built up over 10 years of playing with the system, though. I want to know specifically what about 5th edition needs work. That's the question that I want to answer with this video series. I want to dig into the 2014 Player's Handbook, heck, maybe even the DMG and the Monster Manual, and go chapter by chapter through the full text of the game to see what stands out to me. What worked and should have stayed the way it was, what was plainly broken on its face, and what are the little things that combined into problems bigger than the sum of their parts. These are big questions, and doing this sort of systems analysis isn't an easy task. But I think it's a question worth answering, which is why I want to do a retrospective, a review, if you will, of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And like any good analysis, I think it best that we start at the beginning, with the... We can quibble about the distinction between sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy, but this is all preamble. You could iterate on the pitch all day and still find something wrong with it. The meat of the chapter, the introduction, is pretty functional when you break it down. It starts with a nice, if brief, example of an exchange between a player and DM during actual play that serves as a pretty functional microcosm of D&D. The DM sets the scene, the player asks some clarifying questions, and eventually takes actions that require a dice roll, which the DM adjudicates before moving on to the next point of inquiry. It's probably the best conceivable way to open a TTRPG rulebook, and if there's any criticism to be made here, it's that I want more like this. Expand on this scene here. Give us more scenes like this in other rules-heavy chapters, like those that center on adventuring, combat, and spells. The contextualization that follows the actual play example is useful too, although there are some points here that could have benefited from discrete subheaders for emphasis. There's also something here that could have been better emphasized. The DM and player are collaborators, not adversaries. I think that's a point that really can't be repeated enough. The introduction hints at it, but given the confusion that abounds online regarding this dynamic, it's something that warrants stating explicitly and as early as possible. The rest of the introduction goes over the major components of the game. There's a brief section on settings, which the DM is responsible for, so the Player's Handbook really shouldn't dwell on that. There's a short summary on the Player's Handbook contents, which is a very good practice for long-form content, and the last 2 sections are the bones of the game rules. The call and response formats, the dice that are used to adjudicate chances to fail or succeed, which is the core D20 mechanic, and advantage and disadvantage, the mechanic 5th edition introduced that was intended to replace all of the situational +2s and -1s that could accrue in the previous versions of the game. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge this mechanic. Advantage is probably 5th edition's most impactful innovation, and it has a lot to do with the edition's success. 5e was ostensibly designed to be a simpler system than preceding editions, and part of that was clamping down on the pretty complicated network of math that governed player characters. This roll 2d20 and take the higher or lower value mechanic replaced a lot of fiddly conditional modifiers that were codified into the game back then, and by stripping all of that out in favor of this very simple but versatile rule, they made the game significantly more accessible to new players. This rule gets expanded on in the Using Ability Scores chapter later, but introducing it this early in the book is a very good call. The final segment of the introduction is about adventures, which again are primarily a DM responsibility, so outside of summarizing what player characters are actually going to do, there's not much more to this subject that needs to be covered in the Player's Handbook. There is some behind the curtain talk about the 3 pillars of adventure here. Again, it's irrelevant to players outside of knowing what they're in store for, and I will absolutely make a case in later videos that DM guidance in 5e needs help. And there's also a short tidbit about magic to wrap the section up. It's overall a very serviceable introduction to the game. There's not really anything missing or out of place. They very clearly telegraph what's coming in the rest of the book, and the big mechanical innovation for the edition is showcased as early as page 7. It's simple stuff. There's a few things that could use a touch-up, but overall it works. The next chapter is where the rules really start. Okay, that's a clunky chapter title. I'm not sure why this wasn't just called character creation. Anyways, the guidelines for character creation in 5th edition are pretty straightforward and plainly written. Overall, there's not much here that the book is lacking for in any respect, although I do take issue with the example provided in this chapter. The actual rules text for character creation is interspersed with an example that follows the creation of Bruenor, a dwarven fighter. This is a helpful impulse, but I'd like to make the case that these paragraphs should have been consolidated into a single, discrete section of their own, rather than being sprinkled across the chapter. Interspersed interspersing the example text with the actual rules text is a hit to scannability, especially since it uses the same subheading as some of the important subsections, and it's not even consistently the last subsection of each step. Step 3 has the Bruinor example coming before the customizing ability score rules. So if you're looking specifically for the Bruinor bits and anticipating a pattern, the book breaks its own pattern. Either make building Bruinor its own section under a header towards the end of the chapter, or make it a sidebar. An example is valuable, but this is not laid out well. Example issues aside, this chapter does do something very important for new players. This is where we get our first exposure to the parlance of 5th edition. Class features, proficiency, hit points, armor class, difficulty class, saving throws, attack rolls, ability scores. All of this is the book's first exposure of these terms to the reader, and it's a decent chunk of information to internalize at once. If you're familiar with TTRPGs in any respect, or even just CRPGs, there's a lot of overlap in terminology, and there's a lot of transferable knowledge that one can pull from here. Good on Wizards for not muddying things up too much with a ton of super unique but unusual keywords. Most of these terms have been around for decades in the TTRPG world, and there's not much here that a veteran won't recognize. So we've got a good framework for building the game around that will keep both old and new players on the same page as well. Getting back to actual character creation, the step-by-step process the readers walk through is pretty straightforward. You pick a race, you pick a class, you start at level 1, generate starting hit points, note your +2 proficiency bonus, generate ability scores as directed by your DM, do some character developing, and pick your starting equipment. There's a case to be made here that there should be a discrete section here covering the process of leveling your character up if the group is planning to start with higher level characters than just first level. Think like a subheading labeled 6, starting at higher level, but that's covered well enough in the last section of the chapter about leveling up. It would just be nice if this was mentioned in the actual character creation section. Speaking of leveling is a pretty important facet of a character in any TTRPG, and this section is probably the best placement the discussion of the subject could have. The section is a little short, but that's for the better. This should not be a daunting process. The actual steps of leveling could have been discreetly bulleted or numbered for better readability, but it's functional as is. There's also a final little section about tiers of play, another concept that is really more relevant to the DM than the players as a general guideline for adventure building. It does nicely preview the sorts of power levels players can expect to achieve as they level up, so it's something to look forward to, I suppose. That's nice. Finally, there's the character advancement table, which is an extremely important string of data that really should have been replicated in an appendix dedicated to important tables or something. Alternatively, maybe this information could have been replicated in a column on each of the class tables. That would be my vote. Either way, this is one of those tables you will refer back to constantly if your table uses XP leveling. And as is, you just have to remember that this table exists, and it is on page 15, which is not a small task for a book with over 300 pages in it. Overall, the core of the chapter achieves its goal without too much fuss. There's some formatting and organizational decisions here that I think could be improved upon, but again, we're just getting started. The first really big chapter of the Player's Handbook is up next, and it's the first chapter with actual player-relevant mechanics described in it, the races, and we'll cover those next time.